Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Aisha and Meghna. I'm actually feeling like a student sitting between both these giants in economic theory. Thank you, Krishnamurthy, for joining us, and thank you, Hamish, for being here. Krishnamurthy ji, I'll start with you. In fact, I must say, your latest book, India at 100, which actually reflects how Indian economy and India as a nation will perform when we hit 100 years of independence. Congratulations. It happens to be national bestseller. Please give him a huge round of applause for that. And, we always take pride in doing events like, let's say, India Economic Conclave and many more, where we talk about how India can fast track to maybe 5 trillion, 10 trillion, so on and so forth. Krishnamurthy sir's book actually claims that by 2047, India will be a $50 trillion plus economy. I think that deserves a huge round of applause, that kind of confidence, and it's backed by a very solid theory. So I want to start with that. Sir, please, over to you, how this is going to happen.
Thank you very much, Mihir, and thanks to Times Network for having me here. It's a privilege to be speaking on this occasion. So let me start by giving a couple of anchoring examples. Oftentimes, we do not believe that over a 20-25 year period, we don't understand the power of compounding as well. And that's why it's important to start with inspiring examples. Take Japan from 1970 to 1995, 25-year period. The Japanese economy multiplied its nominal GDP in dollar terms by 25.6 times. China, similarly, 1996 to 2021, multiplied its GDP by 22 times. And what I'm projecting is a multiplication of the GDP much less than that at about 15, 16 times. For those of you who are interested, I've actually bottoms up. These are not assumptions. I've actually postulated what is India's growth potential, what is the likely inflation, and what's the currency depreciation likely to be. 8% growth, which is what India can indeed actually muster. 5% inflation, which is what has prevailed after the inflation targeting regime was put in place in 2016. And, in contrast to about 3.5% rate of depreciation, which is what has prevailed, in the past, I anticipate the rupee depreciation vis-a-vis the dollar to be less than 1%. Primarily because, this depreciation of 3.5% prevailed when the inflation in India was 7.5% prior to 2016, when the inflation targeting regime was implemented. But post-2016, inflation has been only 5%. Now, I'm sure people will, say, not only, they'll, feel sometimes it's high, but indeed it has decreased from 7.5% to 5%. And this is an important conceptual aspect that when inflation reduces, the erosion in the value of the currency, actually domestic currency, reduces. As a result, the nominal value of the currency has to adjust less to be able to keep the purchasing power the same. Therefore, lower inflation translates into lower depreciation. So I'm anticipating and I'm projecting the rate of depreciation to be less than 1%. So if you put it together, 8 plus 5, that is nominal growth in rupee terms at 13%. Subtract 1% because depreciation reduces the value in dollar terms. 13 minus 1 is 12%. Use the rule of 72, which tells you how many years it takes to double your money. 72 divided by 12 is 6 years. So GDP doubles in nominal dollars every 6 years. From 2023 to 2047 is a 24-year period. So 4 doublings in that, 24-year period, because GDP is doubling every 6 years. That's 2 to the power 4, which is 16 times. In 2023, India's GDP was 3.28 trillion. Let's round it off to 3.25. So 3.25 to 6.5, that's your first doubling. 6.5 to 13, that's your second doubling. 13 to 26, that's your third doubling. And 26 to 52 is your fourth doubling. That is close to the $55 trillion economy. And that is why I actually think that when you start understanding the power of compounding, and you actually really get to the brass tacks and project what is the real growth, inflation, and the rate of depreciation, actually I do believe that this is possible. I want to end this, my opening remarks by reminding our viewers about a quote that I love about Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos says that, we humans have this tendency to overestimate risk or negative aspects and underestimate opportunity or positives. And I think that is something which is important, because oftentimes, especially on economic aspects, one sees a lot of cynicism around. The difference between a cynic and a visionary is that a cynic looks for a challenge in every opportunity, a visionary looks for an opportunity in every challenge. And there are too many cynics around. I think let's be visionaries, therefore.
That's very well put. But Mr. Subramanian, even if we go by that logic, I have a feeling that somewhere you are trying to be slightly conservative, because what you're predicting is that the Indian economy will be growing by 16 times by 2047. Which clearly means that actually there is a possibility of an upside.
There is a possibility of an upside, and I think it is important to understand here that, for instance, the Japanese economy, the Japanese yen during this period, 1970 to 1995, appreciated its currency. Currency appreciated about 4 times. And if you would recall, about a month back, Mr. K.V. Kamath, my first boss, had written a piece in the Times of India where he highlighted this aspect and said that this $55 trillion, which is 15 times multiplication, is eminently doable. Now, I actually have been conservative on some dimensions, because when people do not take into account the impact of compounding from about $4 trillion, 55 seems too far. Precisely because, as I said, humans underestimate opportunity. And that's why I actually have chosen to be conservative. But even if, let's say, we go by that conservative, 50 trillion, India will be rubbing shoulders with the, with the largest economy in the world. And I think that is a prospect that is absolutely mouth-watering.
Absolutely. Now let me go to the other side of the stage, where I have the other best-selling author, Hamish. Hamish, your book actually, reflects very well about the future of global economy. As Mr. Subramanian mentioned, that India is going to be a force to reckon with, and obviously it's going to be one of the top 3 largest economies. And when you sort of coincide that with China, which is slowing down and looks like it will continue to slow down, so maybe the best is behind them. What will be the shape of world economy in, let's say, 2047?
Well, it's a huge subject. Am I live?
Yeah.
I'm live
Yes,
on that.
yes.
Good. It's a huge subject, and we always get the future wrong. But I think that we can be very certain that the number 3 issue is no question. We can be very certain, I think, that the United States will remain dominant through the next generation. Every time people doubt how the US is performing, it surprises us. And it's surprised us now in the creation of technology. AI, just in the last 2 years, changes everything. I think the next question, the really interesting one, is how fast does China fade? In shorthand, China is the great manufacturing economy of the emerging world. India is the great services economy of the emerging world. And I think that there are 2 reasons why China will probably fade relative to India in the next few years. One is this point that there is pushback globally against trade in goods, but trade in services, there is much less pushback. Indeed, it is growing, and that's a potential strength. The second is demography. Very simply, if you don't need to be a whiz at maths, that if you have the birth rates that are now pertaining in Shanghai, that's 0.6 babies per mum on average, something like that, and indeed in the rest of China, this population will fall very fast. And if you look at this combination of pushback against China and falling population, I think you can create the possibility that at some stage in the second half of this century, actually, it won't be a question of India number 3, it'll be a question of India number 2.
Which side is your conviction higher? India at number 2 or India at number 3 in the second half of this century?
Exactly. I mean, I think the US remains number 1. by the end of this century, India will certainly be as large as an economy as China. Now, whether it's just ahead, just behind, I don't think that matters. I think the big point is that we should all be bulls of India.
All right. Sir, next question is for you. So if we go by this theory, and clearly he is almost sort of supplementing your theory. My question is, you mentioned, that we tend to look at risks much more closely and sort of underestimate opportunities. If Indian economy has to grow by 16 times between now and let's say 2047, which are the key drivers or key engines which will actually drive this growth?
I think that's a very good question. And I'm glad you asked this because, some of those who actually focus far more on the challenges, will think that, okay, India has grown on average at 7% from 1991 onwards. But we're talking about, growing from a few $100 billion to about, $4 trillion. And growing at 7% from a few $100 billion to, let's say, 4 trillion is fine. But from here on, from 4 trillion to 5, 10 and beyond, being able to grow at that 7, 8%, is it possible? That's a question that people will have. And I think here it is important, therefore, to understand the difference in the pattern of growth that India will have vis-a-vis what the advanced economies have had, or even, for instance, what the growth that China has had. And I think ours will be similar in that sense that, when you look at advanced economies, because the advanced economies set the frontier of the economy, their growth has been from pushing that frontier. For instance, AI. If you look at in the 90s, it was the arrival of the internet that basically generated the productivity shock. In the 2000s, it was the outsourcing that, Hamish was rightly mentioning. But when you look at India's growth, it will be catch-up growth. And I think that is where, it is different because, what we economists think about the law of diminishing returns, which is that, you can grow at 7% from, let's say, a few $100 billion to 4, 5 trillion. Beyond that, growth rates, slack down. That is because if you have to have frontier growth, you need new ideas, new business models, and which will basically be much harder to come by once you are, let's say, 10 trillion, vis-a-vis, catch-up growth. And I think this is really important to understand because those who are skeptical about 7, 8% growth will actually have, in some sense, behind their, in the mindset of basically, frontier growth that the advanced economies have had. There are many sources of catch-up growth that India can have, and actually across 27 chapters in the book, I've covered most of these, but for the purpose of today's conversation, I'll just focus on 3. There is the formalization of the economy. Second is productivity growth of our formal sector firms itself. And third is credit creation. And let me just add a little bit more flesh to this and sort of give some data on this. Let me start with formalization. The advanced economies are entirely formalized. In contrast, estimates vary, but anywhere between half to 2/3 of today's economy, India's economy today, is still informal. And by 2047, quite likely will be very formal, but unlikely to be 100% formal even then. There will be some potential to formalize even beyond 2047. Therefore, the diminishing returns ain't setting in up until 2047. And that will lead to investment rate going up and also productivity, because one of the things that almost every economist actually agrees, we economists typically disagree on a lot of things, is that formalization enhances productivity growth because formal sector firms are much more productive than informal sector firms. Second is productivity growth of the formal sector firms itself. If you take the typical Indian firm that is maybe half as productive or 1/3 as productive as an American counterpart or a German or a Japanese counterpart. But here's where actually the momentum that we've had on innovation and entrepreneurship over the last 10 years is quite salient to take note of. Using the Global Innovation Index, in 2015, India was ranked 85th in the world. Latest rankings, 2024, we are ranked 39th in the world. From 85th to 39 is a very good, that's great momentum. If you ask me, I'm not happy with 39 either. The 5th largest economy should aspire to be in the top 20, 15, and maybe top 10, but the momentum cannot be ignored, and that is something which will actually lead to productivity growth. Similarly, if you look at entrepreneurship, and I'm using World Bank's data, our counterpart actually on Pennsylvania Street, they estimate, use the new firm creation. From 2004 to 2014, it was only 3.2% per annum. Since 2014, it's orders of magnitude higher. As a result, we have the third largest entrepreneurial ecosystem, more than 120 unicorns. So that momentum is there as well on productivity growth. Finally, on credit creation, I think again data tells us there's enormous scope to improve here. If you look at the ratio of private credit to GDP, in an economy, which tells you how much credit creation there is in the economy, because private credit is basically credit given to individuals and to businesses. As a proportion of GDP, in 2020, the world average was 150%. Guess what India was? India was 58%. From 58% to 150%, there is enormous scope to grow. And here as well, I'm not dreaming. I'm actually saying this based on actual action on the ground. The public digital infrastructure that's been created, that can lead to actually somebody, if you walk across, go to Sarojini Nagar here, the person who actually sells, wallets or belts on the street, he can now get credit because he can walk to a branch and say, look, I have actually data on my Google Pay, on my Paytm, which tells me I earn 50,000 rupees a month. Based on 3 years of data that I have actually now, give me a loan, which was not possible earlier. So the combination of these, of course, I've not talked about bureaucratic efficiency, judicial efficiency, human capital, both through healthcare, education, the entire digitization of the economy. These are all aspects also that will basically, enable the catch-up growth. So overall, these are basically the critical ones. Finally, manufacturing. I think that is really critical for India to create jobs and thereby, have growth that is both socially and economically inclusive. And that's why manufacturing is really critical for that. These are the areas that I think will really drive our growth going forward.
You mentioned jobs. So you don't really see jobs or skilling or the current education system as a major challenge?
No, I wouldn't say that. That's not. I think that is an aspect. As I said before at the outset, I'm someone who likes looking at the opportunity in a challenge. And there is enormous opportunity there. I think right now, these three drivers, as I mentioned, formalization, productivity growth, and credit creation will basically deliver that momentum for the next, few years, for a decade. After that, I think it'll be important to make sure that human capital is upskilled, definitely. And so, the investments that we start putting into human capital, both on healthcare and education now, will help us for the next round of growth, in a few years from now. That is something which we have to emphasize on, and that is why, there's a full chapter on healthcare, another chapter on education that I've focused on. On healthcare, and I want to actually highlight this, right? The first chart in that chapter, it basically shows that if you increase public spending, on healthcare from about, 1.5% to 2% of GDP, which is what it cumulatively is now, to about 3%, the out-of-pocket spending that, households have to do decreases 2/3. And I think that is something that will be phenomenal because it will lead to much better health. If you look at Ayushman Bharat, there is clear evidence now that has reduced, for the first time in India's 75-year history, the out-of-pocket spending has reduced below 50% because of Ayushman Bharat. I think the evidence is therefore there. If states, especially some of our, rich states, actually, they should step up on healthcare spending. And I think in some sense, what I want to do is to put the spotlight on states for reforms. The center has been reforming, but states now really need to be focusing on manufacturing, on healthcare, on agriculture. It's the states for them to do reforms. And, just a couple of more minutes to explain why states are important. If you take manufacturing, right? Of the 6 inputs that a manufacturing sector firm needs, what are those? That's land, labor, capital, power, logistics or transportation and scale, economics of scale, which comes from ease of doing business. Of that, except capital, 5 of those inputs are all state-level subjects. And it is important now that the media and us citizens start asking the question, when a Maharashtra government state budget or a Gujarat or a Tamil Nadu or a Andhra Pradesh government state budget is presented, we have to ask them, much like, when I was part of government, I've actually had the privilege of doing 4 budgets. We used to go to CII, FICCI, ASSOCHAM, etc., explain the reforms that have been done. But are we asking questions of our state chief ministers and state finance ministers? What are the reforms you have done on land? What are the reforms you have done on labor? Now it is time that Times Now, and other media houses basically start analyzing the state budgets, because right now the focus has to be on states to do reforms. That is what is really required for India to be able to grow its manufacturing, healthcare, agriculture, and thereby deliver that 8% growth.
That's a brilliant point, and we definitely will take note of it. Hamish, my next question is for you. If we reflect on last 2,000 years, if we reflect on last 2,000 years economic history, global economic history, actually, almost for 1700 years, India and China have dominated the global economy, right? Are we saying that in 21st century as well, it's basically US, India and China which are going to decide the destiny, shape and direction of global economy, with a real possibility of India actually taking China out and claiming number 2 spot in the second half of the century? Because what I'm hearing from your theory is that China on the economic front has topped out.
Well, I think we have to be careful about China. I don't think anything should take away from its achievements, lifting whatever it is, 1 billion people, 800 million people out of poverty. That's a huge achievement. And that's a beacon in some ways for India and indeed for Africa, for much of sub-Saharan Africa. But I think I'm allowed to say this book of mine, the Chinese wanted to publish it, but actually they would want changes in what was said, and that's a path down which authors cannot go, and so it was published in Taiwan instead. There are difficulties in China, and I think that there is a strong probability that there will be some kind of discontinuity in China, probably in the next decade of this century. And we can't see any of the detail, but I think that if you wanted a template, maybe Japan, going from being the outward-looking, in its own terms, quite aggressive, forceful country in the 1990s, until 1990, and then becoming a more inward-looking country, trying to look after its own people better. And I think that transformation in China will make life easier for everyone, including India. And I think we will then come at that stage to be looking alongside America. And do not play down Europe. Europe just becomes less important, but it's still, I think, fundamentally a force for good in the world. I think at that stage we start to look to India for more political leadership, and that political leadership will be respected and needed by the world, because we need three societies trying to nudge the world into a better future, not just one or two.
Right. But let me ask you about China. The second point which you made about discontinuation of some sort. Are you also hinting at a societal restructuring or democratic reforms, if I may use that term, as far as China is concerned? Because then that's a huge possibility which you are hinting at.
I don't know. I don't know. One of the lessons you learn if you write about the future is you will be wrong.
Right.
And I think it's more important to think of ourselves as tour guides, bringing us all on this journey that we have to march along, arm in arm, together into the future. I think the balance of probability is that China will make a successful transition towards an inward-looking society that looks after its own people better. And that will actually be a model for the world as well. But I cannot exclude the possibility that there will be some kind of serious breakdown. I mean, these things do happen. And I hope that whatever this change is, it'll be conducted in a way which is calm and right for the Chinese people.
Right. Mr. Subramanian, do you feel concerned about a couple of things I want to put on the table, because without that, in an ideal scenario, then there is no risk. But if we look at global scenario right now, and yesterday also we had a very interesting conversation on this, geopolitical situation, Trump 2.0, what is happening to globalization, China +1 theory, and Europe sort of stagnant, struggling to even revive growth. And within Europe also, if you look at the components, each country has a unique problem. So, so Germany has a different issue, France has a different problem, including demographics. Do you feel concerned that with so many moving parts, it may actually end up affecting India's growth trajectory?
Good question, Mihir, but let me just quickly compliment what Hamish mentioned about those who predict the future being wrong, more often than not. I'm reminded of, this example from cricket. I think everybody here would understand. In 1993, when Sachin had just come onto the scene, Sunil Gavaskar had predicted that by the time Sachin hangs up his boots, if he doesn't score at 40 international hundreds, I'd personally go and strangle him, right? Now he was wrong, but he was wrong. Actually, Sachin scored 100 international hundreds. We would love to be proved wrong in that manner as well. I think when you talk about risks, right? Look, every country's growth, I think, always has opportunities and challenges. I gave the example of Japan, and I want to remind our viewers. If you take Japan from 1970 to 1995, looking back today, people will think that, that was something that was like a honeymoon affair. No, it was not. That was a period when the oil shock happened. As a result of the oil shock, there was basically double-digit inflation in the United States, which basically, the US did not see even now, following the Ukraine war, COVID and Ukraine war. And there was a Volcker phenomenon, interest rates that were incredibly high. Obviously, that had impact on growth. But Japan actually focused on its strengths and actually worked hard to make sure that it actually took care of those challenges and grew. And I think this is where I want to point out, when we think rigorously, if we sort of think a little bit superficially, I think we tend to overblow some of the effects of global factors. And I want to actually sort of lay this down very rigorously for the benefit of our viewers. If you take GDP, and what is GDP comprised of? It's comprised of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, right? Let's break this down for the Indian economy. 60% of our GDP comes from consumption, which is primarily domestic, entirely domestic. Investment, 30% of our GDP comes from investment. And FDI as of today is 1.5%. That's a small fraction. So investment is also domestic, right? Government spending is 10% of GDP. Now, each of these actually do vary plus minus 2%. But you put it together, 60 plus 30 plus 10, that's 100%. Almost entire of our GDP actually comes from domestic factors. Yes, net exports does get impacted, but net exports has exports and imports as well. And global factors will have an impact on exports, but will have an impact on imports as well. So I think when we do not do this quantitative exercise, in sort of, pardon me for using this expression, in Hindi we say, hawa mein baat karte hain. When we sort of speak superficially, we end up overblowing some of these, risks, in my opinion. I think the key point from this is that the way, our cricket captains say that I would not worry about the opposition, I will focus on my own team's strengths. That is what India has to do as well. There are enough strengths. As a large economy with a very large labor base, I think we have absolutely enough to do just by ourselves. And as I said, I will put the focus on states. States now need to start doing reforms. If states can start doing reforms actually, and we are, as citizens and the media and the industry association start asking them pointed questions about what are the reforms you've done, on ease of living, on ease of doing business, then I think we don't need to worry as much about the global factors, because the work to do for us is all on the domestic front.
Right, but purely as an economist, are you slightly concerned? I'm taking a cue from your the point on states. More and more states are actually showing tendency of, increasing freebies in some or the other form now. And thanks to the direct benefit transfer, it's much more efficient and easier. Is it a cause of concern?
I think, this is a good question. See, it is important to make sure that when we talk about these things, we don't talk about in a black and white way. In any democracy, even in the US, for instance, or the United Kingdom, you will have some variation of the mix of absolutely good economic policies and some policies that are for the here and now. That is basically a reality of a democracy. Now, that is not to say that actually, from an economic perspective, we should not be pushing for better economic policy, better spending of the taxpayers' money. Here, I've said this multiple times. If you take revenue expenditure, which is what freebies are, vis-a-vis capital expenditure, revenue expenditure, if the fisc spends, let's say, a rupee, the economy accumulates about 92 to 93 paise. In other words, 7 to 8 paise basically gets lost, right? In contrast, when it's spent on expenditure, on basically capital expenditure, that could be on healthcare, it could be on education, it could be on infrastructure creation, it could be on digital economy creation. All those actually add to the economy anywhere between 3 to 4 rupees. So clearly, if you were investing your money, and I'm sure you all do this, right? You will never invest your 1 rupee to get 92 paise. You will certainly invest that 1 rupee to get 3 rupees or 4 rupees. So clearly, the importance of better expenditures, better spending of the taxpayers' money is critical. With the caveat that in a democracy you will get some bit of that. What is important is to not go too excessive on that. And here, one more nuance I want to add, right? When you think about freebies versus, let's say, good spending, the difference I want to make is distributing loaves of fish versus teaching someone to fish. I think that's the key difference. And here, the nuance I want to add is, and I think as men, this point will not be something that will be flattering to us. But the reality is, when money reaches the purse of a woman, a grihani, right? They spend it far, far better than when it reaches the pocket of a man, right? And I think this is something that economic research shows very well, that if, for instance, money reaches mothers and grandmothers, they spend it on education, they spend it on food, they spend it on the health of the family. In contrast, very often when it goes to the man, it's spent either on gambling or maybe on alcohol, and that is why this distinction between even on direct benefit transfers, if it goes to the women, it's actually relatively better, because it actually does have the capability to create abilities to teach them to fish. I think if you take examples of for instance, the PM Awas Yojana, right, which is basically created, enabled people to buy houses. That's a very good example. Take Ayushman Bharat, very good example again of taxpayer spending. Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, we had shown this in the economic survey that, 2018-19, that malaria deaths, cholera deaths, and all these waterborne diseases had declined significantly as a result of the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. Now there's an article in Nature showing the same thing as well. So these clearly show that when when politics is about, creating capabilities in the common people, that is much better politics there. That's an area where economics and politics are sort of aligned well. But when it is only about actually distributing freebies, that is where the politics and the economics come into tension with each other. And as an economist, I actually highly recommend, the capability building politics. And I think if you look at some of the states where state governments have come back to power repeatedly, it is by using this kind of spending, capabilities. Because, nothing better than a voter who basically feels that my life has been path-breakingly uplifted. Then he feels grateful and therefore brings the government back into power. I think there are enough and more examples in our states of states coming back to power, and that is when economics and politics come together. This freebie, which is actually economics and politics at tension, is something that can keep a government, maybe get them into power once, but does not get them back again and again.
That's a very valid point, interesting point. Hamish, I have a follow-up for him. If you allow, I'll quickly take that follow-up question and then I'll come back to you.
May I just say one quick thing?
Yeah, please.
I so agree. The world is the world not of blacks and whites, but of greys, and we should not let the optimal, the best, become the enemy of the good enough.
Absolutely. Quick question to you. Are you concerned? I won't use the word concern, but the capex, if you look at, I mean, the government has actually contributed in a really big way in last couple of years by spending on infrastructure, creating digital ecosystem and everything. Yeah. Now, I think the onus lies on private sector to step up.
Indeed.
What will kickstart that engine?
So, here I actually want to use this platform to highlight something that our corporates should be thinking about. Oftentimes when I talk to corporates, they basically say, oh, I'm worried about demand not coming in, and, or because maybe demand is not as good, that's why I'm not spending on. There are two fundamental points that I want to make here. If you look at even Q2, growth, right? On a base of about 5.2%, right? Consumption grew at over 6%. So I think the fact that consumption is not growing as much is something that maybe doesn't match up with the data, as nature of consumption is changing. And I think, for instance, some of the not so healthy consumption that was being indulged in pre-COVID is actually a thing of the past. People are doing a lot more, healthy consumption. I think that's... But more importantly, I want to remind especially our corporates, and if there are office bearers of the CII, of FICCI and others that are listening, I think I would like to highlight what we economists are taught, which is called Say's law. Say's law essentially says that supply creates its own demand. And I think there are a zillion examples of that if we just observe it. Take the iPhone as an example. I don't think 10 years back we demanded the iPhone. It's only the supply of the iPhone that has basically created the demand for the iPhone. It is the supply of infrastructure, airports, ports, etc. that creates the demand for it. It's the supply of roads, good roads, that again creates a demand for it. It's the supply of so many things. I think this is an aspect that actually, because this is chicken and egg in some sense. And what I'm really trying to point out by highlighting Say's law, that it is indeed actually supply very often that is the chicken, and demand through job creation, through disposable income, coming in the hands of people and thereby consumption, that is the egg. And this is an aspect actually that industry associations must take into account, because when an individual firm basically only looks at the demand, that basically it can cater to on its own. But I think industry associations need to come together, not just to network. Network is great, but they also need to set the agenda on what the industry needs. And I think it's aspects of coordination, when basically there can be what is called the free rider problem. The free rider problem, whenever I explain to students, I actually explained it using 3 characters. Everybody, somebody, nobody. Free rider problem is everybody thinks that somebody else should do it and therefore nobody does it. That is the case, I think, with investment as well. And that's where coordination becomes really critical. The CIIs, the FICCIs of the world, ASSOCHAMs, need to actually bring their leaders together along with other thinkers to make sure that this is understood well, that it's investment that actually leads to oftentimes the virtuous cycle. In that 9 pins actually at the macro level, whether it's consumption growth, etc., it's private investment that actually is the first pin that makes the other pins fall. And this is something that industry needs to understand.
Very interesting point. Hamish, like Mr. Subramanian was saying, that we tend to sometimes, overweight the risk or look at risks through magnifying glass. Do you think Trump 2.0 and its impact on globalization is slightly overrated?
Again, I don't know. It's a very, very interesting issue. Globalization, if you look at the numbers, measured international trade as a proportion of global GDP.
Okay, let me rephrase it. Global economy, actually. Globalization may not be the right term. I'm talking about global economy. The
threats to the global economy.
Yeah.
We will have slower growth through the second half of this century than we've had in the past. Things will slow down. And there are all sorts of reasons for this, including the environment, I think, including the aging of the global population. Indeed, one of the really interesting things that's happening is that projections for growth of humankind are being revised down the whole time. Whereas 3 or 4 years ago, pre-pandemic, the UN central estimate was for population to top out in around the end of this century. Now it's coming forward. And I even saw some work by HSBC just this year suggesting it's just possible global population growth may top out in 15 years' time. Now, I don't think that will happen. But I think in this march to the future, we have to keep on looking at data, and when it changes, we change our minds. And so I think that the big path of the global economy will be for slower growth, not here, but certainly if you look globally through. And I think growth that is more trying to improve living standards in healthcare, we talk, giving better lives to people, creating a middle-class world where the values of the middle class dominate the world. And we're already, it's fascinating here being in India, seeing India becoming a dominant middle-class country. And I think that's one of the aims for 2045, that this will be, 3/4 of the population will be middle class. And so I think that when looking at the world economy in the total, we have to look not just at the numbers, but at the quality of life, and that how we nudge the world into making a better place for humankind through the second half of this century. It's an oblique response to what you say, but I do believe passionately that we're economists, we look at numbers, we understand numbers, we look at GDP, but there are things beyond that which I think are just profoundly important, and I think that's one of the areas to which the world will look for leadership from India.
That's in fact, I appreciate the philosophical side of the answer that you gave. But coming back to my question, my question was actually more of a short-term future, that how the new US administration under Mr. Donald Trump in his second term will behave and what impact it will have on global economy, because China seems to be sort of preparing for a trade war. Europe has its own reservations, and then there is India and the BRICS bloc.
I was worried you'd pin me down. Look, there have been long periods in the past where America has gone into inward-looking protectionist mode. It's happened before, happens all the time. We, I think, in Britain sometimes misunderstand America. We think our relationship is more positive, better, stronger than it is. The US is transactional. Trump will be supremely transactional. And it is very much in the self-interest of the United States. It remains open to things in the rest of the world. There are ways in which Trump will act, and we can know pretty well, he's unpredictable, but I think we can sketch out American policy reasonably clearly for the next 4 years. And there will be some collateral damage in the trade measures that he takes. There will be, but the pushback will not, I think, be so serious as to destroy the world economy. I don't think we're into the 1930s. I don't think we're into Smoot-Hawley. I don't think we're into imperial preference. So I think that we will be able to manage this next period, a difficult period for the world, in a way which does not do long-term damage to global prosperity.
Right. Mr. Subramanian, I want your view on this, because, look, I'm not trying to sort of overhype Trump 2.0. My simple question is, there have been so many, views on how the world will prepare. He mentioned about collateral damage. What is your view, especially when you talk to your peers in Washington?
Yeah.
What is the view?
So, Mihir, first I want to, speak to the question that you were asking earlier about how India would be as a leader of the world. And
Right.
I think this is an aspect that I think does not get highlighted as much. From the trenches view that I've had being on the board of the IMF now, I think there are two aspects that distinguishes India from the rest of the world civilizationally. First, India has never ever gone and been an aggressor, ever, in its number one. Number two, and we've defended when we have had to defend, and very, very resolutely, and I think the world knows it, but we've never been an aggressor. Second, India has never ever defaulted on any of its obligations. For us, and actually I've had the opportunity to observe this from close quarters, it is not an economic question. Even in 1991, when India faced its worst balance of payments crisis, the government of the day then actually shipped gold to the Bank of England and to the Bank of Japan to actually borrow dollars. We did not default like some of the other countries do. And I think these are aspects actually which are very important for the world to actually notice, that India as a leader will be very different from the way in which, leadership has been, global leadership in the past. And I think this is an aspect that definitely must be recognized. Now, when it comes to actually some of the immediate aspects on trade, and I think what I want to highlight is that when conversations on trade happens, and I think Hamish was mentioning some of this, which is the focus is on trade and trade of goods, and even within that it is often on basically the tariffs, right? But when you look at trade barriers, there are both tariff-based trade barriers and non-tariff barriers. And when you look at trade itself, there is trade of goods and trade of services as well. So if you were to draw this 2x2 matrix where you have goods and services and you have tariffs and non-tariff barriers, the entire sort of debate oftentimes is focused on only one cell, which is the tariffs relating to goods, trade of goods. But I think it is important for India to actually expand this conversation into the entire four cells, not just that one cell. In other words, the conversation needs to be on non-tariff barriers, visas for instance, as well as on, it needs to be definitely on services as well. And that will actually lead to a much more holistic conversation on trade, and that is something that will actually be win-win for everybody, because India's competitive advantage clearly lies in services, and we actually do not use as much non-tariff barriers because non-tariff barriers are far more opaque and less objective compared to tariff barriers, and these are aspects that must be highlighted, the government should highlight, and therefore lead to a much more holistic conversations across these four cells that I just described.
Right. I think it was a very interesting session. Hamish, thank you so much for sharing your views, and Mr. Subramaniam, as always, it was a pleasure. We also have Shri Nitin Gadkari in the hall with us. Please give him a huge round of applause. And Gadkari ji, you will be glad to know that Mr. Subramaniam, just before you walked in, made a very interesting prediction about India's economy, that it will grow 16 times from now till 2047 when India will be at 100. On that note, thank